I am going to look at what I think is happening in the world today, and it's really a talk about the new class or the expert class. That's what I'm going to look at, which I think tries to answer this gentleman's question, which is a very good question, which is why do we not have government for the people, or more particularly by the people? And I think we live in interesting times today in relation to this. So I am historically from what would be described as the far left. I don't know if left or right means very much today. And I actually quite like my favourite sociologist Frank Furedi's depiction where he says, actually, real conservatives, real liberals and real socialists have far more in common with each other than they realise. Which is largely that we actually look at human beings as having capacity rather than as victims and vulnerable, which is one of the big problems we face today. But I digress. So how did I end up here? I ended up here largely because historically in terms of what I looked at. I was a youth worker, thank you, in North Lanarkshire. I lived in Glasgow. And I started to do work on New Labour, the emergence of New Labour and their policing policies, especially around young people. And I became quite interested in the idea of the over-regulation of everyday life, cotton wool kids and things like that. And particularly I got interested in the proliferation of law. And this was ironically something that was noted by Nick Clegg, of all people, who observed, I don't know if you remember this thing that he pointed out. He pointed out that New Labour had introduced a new law for every day they had been in office. And this was after 10 years of New Labour. And what's interesting about this is, I think, in all of the points and anecdotes I'm going to use today, I'm trying to suggest something which I'm just playing with myself. So I'm trying to write this book called The Criminalisation of Everything, or The Criminalisation of Everyday Life, which I'm not getting very far with, but I'm toying with these ideas. And one of the interesting thoughts I had at this time was it's interesting that New Labour look authoritative because they're introducing lots and lots of laws. But actually the opposite is the case. Because if they were authoritative, they could do things through politics, through ideas, through argument, and through other mechanisms. Whereas the use of law is actually a reflection of the collapse of authority, because you have to force people to do things. It's actually a point that Christopher Lasch, brilliant social thinker in America, made in the 1970s in his bestseller called The Culture of Narcissism, where he made the point that the rise of law and order in American politics appeared to reflect the rise of the moral right, but actually reflected its collapse. Because rather than being able to morally convince and argue and campaign, you actually use the stick of the police officer to enforce your policy. So the collapse of morality rather than the rise of moral authority in America. Tangentially, I was thinking about this a little bit in terms of a similar time when I was doing my work looking at these curfews that New Labour was setting up in North Lanarkshire. We used to go out with other families when our children were young. It was the last Friday of every month. We would try and pick a restaurant and we would all go, and all our kids were quite young. And it was an interesting experience because if you went to a Greek or an Italian restaurant, you would find that it was very relaxed because they would come up and they would say, I was going to do a sort of patronising Italian accent or something if the temptation is strong, but I will resist it. Or Greek accents. So Greek Italian restaurants we would go to, and they'd basically come up and say, don't worry about the kids, they're fine. Right? Great. Thank God. Give me a glass of wine, I can relax and have a nice meal. And the reason they were able to do this is because they had authority over other people's children. They were relaxed and they knew that if our kids started running around, they would just, oi! And they were entirely comfortable with that. You go to an English or British restaurant and procedures state, health and safety, please, your children must remain seated. And you spend the next hour wrestling with your child to stay in a seat because we have procedures and a correct way of approaching. And that, I would say, is the modern world, right? And that's the shift that's taken place from an actual, which actually is a reflection again, I think, of the loss of authority, right? Rather than having authority to be able to do things and therefore be relaxed, we have a loss of authority and therefore the need to enforce regulations, rules, procedures, laws, and so on. And this is what has been described as a new form of authoritarianism, or what I'm going to try and discuss today, the rise of a new class or a new elite in society. Another reason that I'm here is, again, connected to Colin and with the work that I did with against the named person campaign. And it's funny whenever I meet Colin, because I always know he knows that we're strange bedfellows. I'm an atheist. He's not an atheist. I've got a Marxist background. I don't think Colin has a Marxist background, to my knowledge. And I can see a sense of confusion. How did this strange atheist revolutionary end up on our side? How has he moved so far? I can see Colin thinking. He has vocalized these thoughts at times. But I would like to suggest to you it's actually the other way around. Because I, throughout my adult life, have been a bit of a revolutionary. And today, defending common sense, basic freedoms, and basic rights is pretty revolutionary. So actually, it's not me that's become conservative. It's a change in society's norms have made Colin a revolutionary. So welcome, comrade. But seriously, in relation to this, I do think we face a problem. It's a problem and also potentially an opportunity. Because I think today just being normal is often to be extreme or to be represented as extreme, to be seen as outrageous. So, for example, if, as I have been doing in Scotland, if I defend the idea that you should be able to smack your child lightly on the hand, like that, and not get arrested for it, I am seen as a promoter of child abuse. Yeah. So something that is entirely normal for the vast majority of people and seen as something that should not be criminal is soon to be criminalised in Scotland. To be more controversial, but I do think this is actually important and, again, very, very illustrative of what's happening in society. Alternatively, you could say it would be normal historically to think that if you have 52% of the population who vote a certain way, then the politicians would understand in a democratic society that you actually have to abide by that 52% of the population. Now, I know everybody here will not be necessarily like-minded on that, but I actually do think this is what we are seeing in this process is very, very illustrative of what I would describe as the new class, the new political class, or the new elite in society. And so talk of the EU brings me to this theme of the new elite. It's a very interesting theme at the minute. It's been brought into a much sharper focus over the last few years because of things like Donald Trump and Brexit and populism. So we are now having a much more upfront discussion about, in particular, this sense of disconnect between the elites and the people, right? And to what extent you think this is true or untrue, this is now a discussion much more than it has been for the last 2 decades. You get terms such as managerialism, which is quite used, the rise of technocrats. So these various terms have become almost commonplace, certainly in my workplace. In workplaces more generally, I think you get a recognition that we've had a shift from a time when bosses would look you in the eye and tell you what they think, to now having this thing called HR, right? Human resource manageresses. And I say that kind of half carefully, but not really, because in my experience, every HR person is a woman, interestingly, who will talk endlessly about correct procedure. Smile, give you a cuddle while she's giving you your P45 or 60 or whatever it is when you get sacked. And there's also a kind of a general discussion today, I think, about complaint about this thing called form filling. That you have to fill out forms all the time. Right? So there's all sorts of areas of our life seem to have changed relatively unnoticed. It just seemed to happen, these things. This HR thing happens. This technocratic, managerial type of world seems to have sort of emerged around us. Now, looking at this sociologically in terms of this thing, the new class, and there's all sorts of different angles and aspects of this, and you can pick apart various bits of it, I think, legitimately. But Alvin Gouldner is one of the first. In the late 1970s, he produced a book that was looking at the new class. And he was looking at particularly the new knowledge class. He gave it a long time. He describes the emergence of this new class, but says, now we're really the old establishment, the old money class, the old ruling class, if you like. They are no longer really running society. It's really this knowledge class, a kind of slightly flawed knowledge class. He was kind of sympathetic, but quite slightly supportive as well. I think much more overtly, I think this group of people has emerged in the 1990s. And Tony Blair's the sort of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, from that era onwards, I think you've seen this much more clearly. And from my, with my Marxist hat on, I would see this as being very much to do with the collapse of class, which has had an interesting thing, not just the collapse of class in terms of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the left, but actually an old friend of mine put it nicely. He says the left and right used to be pulling like this, and actually when the left let go, the right end up on their backsides, and you end up with a sort of collapse of conservatism at the same time as you have the collapse of the left. So there's this curious kind of double-edged sword taking place. And in that vacuum, you've had the rise of the expert class. This is when I think you really have this new body of people, not necessarily new, but taking on a new role, taking on a central role in politics and life more generally. Other books we've seen, I don't know if you've come across David Goodhart. David Goodhart's got this thing, the Somewheres and the Anywheres. Anyone know this one? Right? Someone is very, very simply, and to do him a disservice, you can go online, he's got a little 2-minute thing where he just explains his thing. The Somewheres are people who belong somewhere. Right? They are grounded. They generally come from a place that they're relatively proud of, whether that's a community, a nation. They were workers that were doers. You did something, and part of what you were and what made you proud of what you were good at was experience. Right? You were an experienced person, like a crafts person or something, a skilled technical person, based somewhere, grounded with a sense of pride and connection with where you're from. He says that's one group of people, and the other group of people are what he calls the anywheres. I'm like an anywhere in a sense. I'm a university lecturer. I could work anywhere. I have no necessary attachment to where I belong. I'm much more fluid. It's much more. I'm qualification based. So if I get a qualification, I can just work anywhere. I'm not really grounded. And don't really have connections, live, meaningful connections in the same way. And he says there's this shift, right? And he says if you look at the Trump voters, the Brexit voters, there's this thing happening. There's the somewheres and the anywheres, which he thinks is a more useful way of trying to think about society. If you've ever seen a film called Up in the Air, if any of you are George Clooney fans, right? Up in the Air is a really brilliantly clever film, right? Because what George Clooney His job means that he spends almost his entire life either in an airport or in a hotel. Right? He is completely groundless. He has no connection with anybody. He has like affairs here and there. It's a very shallow, loose existence. It's a kind of plastic life, if you like. And that's how, and he thinks he's happy. Of course, it ends up he falls in love with someone and he wants to actually connect. He suddenly realizes that he has an empty existence. Of course, brilliantly, his job is he is someone employed by other employers to sack their workforce for them because they don't have the cojones to sack them for themselves. So he turns up, he's like the devil HR person. That's his job. But he's lovely looking, he's really nicely dressed, he's got his packs, he comes in and he's nice and he has to take all the crap as people swear and cry and so on. That's his job, right? It's perfect. So it's a very clever film at looking at many of these themes that are now coming to the surface. There's another book by a guy called Salvador Babones, titled The New Authoritarians, and then something like Trump, Populism and the Tyranny of Experts. Right? It's a nice little book. I like little books. It's always happy when they arrive and they're small instead of these things. It's a nice small book, very readable. His basic argument is that there was a shift in liberalism. You could debate his explanation of liberalism, but anyway, it's basically this. He says liberalism used to be about defending freedoms. Today, liberalism is about protecting rights. Right? Now, what he means, oh, there you go. So you knew that. I thought the language could be confusing. Someone understands it clearly. So rights are expanding, he says. The rights can be all sorts of things. They become a form of entitlement. They're not based on you being free to do something, but they become an entitlement, something that is given to you. And in that context, experts take over because they adjudicate on rights. Who should have rights, what resources, and so on. So lawyers, experts, quangos, organizations become the arbiter of rights, which is different from the era of freedom, the argument goes. Because if you have an era of freedom, the people in control are the people, at least in principle. Right? You are free with your freedoms to act, to speak, to gather, and so on. But when you have a world built on rights, that needs professional authority of experts to adjudicate on who these rights belong to. And this is expanding, he argues, in more and more areas of life, the rise of rights and the rise of experts adjudicating on them. And if you listen to the Reith lectures recently, so Jonathan Sumpton's been on. The first one's the best, the third one's decent, third one's on human rights, which is one of these rights. You know, like who made this thing human rights suddenly? Who says who gets human rights, who doesn't get human rights? It's not you. It's not me. I've never said anything on human rights. Sounds perfect, though, doesn't it? Who could disagree with human rights? What sort of animal are you, right? It's a lovely term, right? But Jonathan Sumpton, who's sat on the Supreme Court, was essentially questioning this whole concept. But more than that, his first lecture was called The Expanding Empire of Law. And he made the point that essentially what's happening is that increasingly it is lawyers who are making huge decisions about political life rather than politicians. He makes a very nice point about independence, and there's a few people who've made this point. When you say there needs to be an independent decision, that sounds good, right? But what it means is independent from you, because it means independent from politics. And if you're independent from politics, you're independent from the people who are our representatives, who we can put an influence on. So as soon as something is independent, it means you cannot influence that decision. It's an expert who is making that decision. But again, beautiful language, which sounds wonderful, but actually is very different once you start to unpick it. And this is one of the things me and Colin's got a slight disagreement of in terms of the use of the Supreme Court in the named person issue, which I don't know if you know. I'm assuming people have got an idea about the named person in this room in Scotland. And then in the end, the Supreme Court ruled in our favour. And I, in principle, I can't say I'm not happy. right, to laugh at the Scottish government, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the judgment. The problem is that judge could have easily, or those judges could easily judge another way, and there's nothing we can do about it, or very little. And the use of judges, understandable in a frustrating world, but the use of judges, I think we have to be very, very wary of, because it essentially means they are adjudicating on political decisions, I think. And it's that, what we need ultimately is us and another million of us out on the streets saying we refuse to have the named person and the politicians overturning it. Without that, I entirely understand why the Supreme Court seems like a nice option, but I think it's worth bearing in mind that judges are not people that are necessarily to be trusted, and even if they were, they're not the right people, because we can't get rid of them. We cannot unvote a judge out of his position. I think there's only one judge has been got rid of in 350 years British history, something like that, so it's worth bearing that in mind. So in terms of human rights, you've also got, which is I'm going to look at now, is the issue of the family and the rights in relation to the family. Because, of course, again, it's one of those strong arguments where you feel on the defensive, when suddenly you say, what about the children's rights? In fact, at a recent, I go to the Scottish Parliament, occasionally I'm invited in as a kind of like mad sociologist who's on the wrong side. They feel as if they're being very open to allow me in, and I sort of like scream and shout at them. And they sort of like shake their heads, shocked. How can you say that? How can you say smacking a child? How can you do it? Incredible. What about the children's rights? And I say, there's no such thing as children's rights. And that's it. Their heads explode at this point. Because children's rights are really the rights of experts. That's the reality. The expert decides on children's rights. Children don't have power. You can only have genuine, meaningful rights if you can actually exercise them. Children can't, so they're exercised on their behalf by an expert. Children's rights are experts' rights, essentially. And you've had the rise, which is one of the concerns that I've had for quite a long time now, the rise of early intervention policy in social policy and politics. It's probably, I would say, the most important area of policy development in the last 20 years, relating to the family. And this thing, parenting. You no longer have parents, you have parenting. It's become a verb, it's become a skill, therefore something that can be taught to you, rather than something that's based on an institution or a relationship. And you've had a major growth of expertise in this area of early intervention, and a major interest in it by the new political class, by New Labour and subsequent governments. Early intervention, for those that aren't that familiar with it, relates to the first 3 years of a child's life. So in the first 3 years, if the child hasn't had the most perfect, cuddly, woodly parent in the world, they're destroyed. And they're destroyed because you've ruined their brain, right? By your bad parenting, you've actually destroyed the neuroscience says the brain is damaged, and so on. And so this is a major concern, and it's seen as a silver bullet. All social problems are potentially associated with the first 3 years. If only we can get the first 3 years right, then all problems are solved. Now, I'm conscious of this. I rang my friend up yesterday. I'm kind of aware that we probably see things slightly differently, people in this room and myself. I would be more inclined to see social problems as social. And I think you might be more inclined to see that social problems are actually to do with parenting, to an extent, right? And I would probably be bending the stick this way, and you might be a bit more that way. Right? But I think in general would agree that all social problems can't be associated with parents. I don't think world peace and poverty can be associated with the nature of parenting necessarily. But ironically, I also think I think the idea, you don't want to undermine the idea of parental responsibility. I think parental responsibility is very important. But interestingly, I think with the rise of parental experts, you're actually undermining parental responsibility as well, ironically. So what they're doing is they're actually denying the social significance of things on children, and at the same time they're also undermining parental authority. Would be how I see it. And I just want to run through a few things here. So ACEs, I don't know if you've come across ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. Right? This is a huge thing now in Scotland. I think, has this happened in England yet? Right, it'll be coming down to a school, youth club, social work, near you. So everything now can be explained through this thing called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And you've got a list of adverse childhood experiences, negative childhood experiences, and you can tick the boxes, count them up, and therefore you know that this child is going to be, a mass murderer in the future or something. Something's going to go wrong because of these experiences. And I think I just want to say a few problems I have with the early intervention philosophy, the flaws that I think lie within it. The first one is that it's flawed science. Okay? What happens is they use science and neuroscience to say this explains why this is a problem, why bad parenting is a problem. So they get pictures of a brain and they say this is a normal child's brain, this is a sort of adverse, this is a bad child's, he's had a bad time, he's got a tiny brain. And they try and use neuroscience. But actually, if you look at what neuroscientists actually say and what other people have said countering this, there is far more evidence to counter this idea that you have this scientifically proven damaging of the brain through all these different parental activities. And whatever the rights and wrongs of the science, what absolutely does happen is that 95% of the time, I would suggest, the science that questions this idea is ignored. So this isn't like science. If you had a science of like your broken leg, right, and like your legs, you say, if you keep hitting it with a hammer, it's great, and then someone finds evidence saying actually the hitting it with a hammer thing doesn't work. The way science works is you'd say, yeah, the hammer's a bad idea, right? Or you at least have to look at this and have trials. This is not science that we're talking about. So whenever they say that the science says in relation to these issues, this is not science in any meaningful sense. It's actually the use of the term science as a replacement for our argument about belief, right, which I'll come on to. It's also profoundly deterministic. This idea that if a 3-year-old has an unpleasant life, that's basically the end of it. I'll read you, this is Penelope Leach, famous parenting expert, who says, "There remains no scope for argument. It is a fact that the emotional environment of infancy, consisting almost entirely of relationships with the parents or their surrogates, shapes the individual emotionally, psychologically, and neurologically, for good or for ill, forever." Okay, so that's it, forever. Neurologically, forever. Based on a problematic, emotional type of parenting. Now, it's often presented early intervention in a way where you think there's a sense of zeal, right? There's a really positive, dynamic atmosphere around it. But I think that masks and hides a profoundly pessimistic sentiment that underlies it. So, for example, if by the age of 3, that's it, what happens to past ideals about changing society? Right? Let's change society, create a better society, and that can do such and such. Because what's that going to do to poor Bobby who's 3 and got a tiny brain, as far as they're concerned? What happens to morality and religion? Right? Morality and religion used to have a sense that young men, adults, you can challenge them, right? You can make them into better people, right? It's a transformative potential, right? A belief in morals or religious arguments. Well, what's happened to little Bob? No point in him. There's no point having a religious discussion with him or a moral discussion because he's got a little brain, right? There's no point. I mean, they literally, if taken the zealotry that lies behind this. There is no point. But they're similar with education. Historically, education, literature, the joy of knowledge, understanding, these things are transformative, the capacity these can have for young people. These have been ideas that have carried us and inspired us for generations. What's the point? Right? There is no point. Right? That little brain reading Shakespeare, forget about it. Absolutely pointless. Extremely pessimistic, anti-human outlook. And even if you look at things like the criminal justice system, youth work, social work, they all had a sense of transformative capacity. That you can reform people. Just because you're a toe rag at 16 doesn't mean you're going to be a toe rag at 60. Right? You can transform, you can change yourself. Or essentially vanish in the deterministic early intervention mindset. How long have I got?
You have another 10 minutes, or possibly a little longer.
10 should be fine. Right, so the logic of early intervention, is quite interesting and contradictory, or so it appears. The logic of early intervention is that parents are everything. Parents are the cause and solution of every social problem. Parents are everything, but parenting is an impossible task. Right? And I love this, and you find it was particular at the time. Barack Obama, I can remember saying this, Tony Blair saying this, I wonder how many others, don't know if David Cameron did, entirely possible. Parenting, it's the toughest job in the world. Aren't they nice? It's the toughest job in the world. Of course, if it's the toughest job in the world, you can't do it, right? How are you meant to do it if it's the toughest job in the world? Of course, it's not the toughest job in the world, from my experience. It's an extremely easy job in comparison to lots of jobs, right? This idea, we've become too accepted, it's the toughest job in the world, right? It's not, right? It is not. If it was the toughest job in the world, humanity would have disappeared millennia ago, right? It's just not, right? Some of us have difficult kids, but it is not the most difficult job in the world. Let's get over ourselves. Parents are gods. They promote this idea, but they are flawed gods. And this is the rub, right? Because essentially, it's so important that you can't really be left to your own devices, because it's the hardest job in the world. You need support, right? And it's not just people that really, really, really need support. You need support, right? Everybody needs support. It's the toughest job in the world. David Cameron said everyone should go to parenting classes. This is a conservative prime minister. This isn't a Marxist. This is David Cameron telling everybody, I mean, imagine it, the profundity of the change in the relationship of a private unit where you go to an expert for them to tell you how to relate to your child, right? If taken seriously. It's revolutionary, right? In its negative impact. And we all need support. If you watch soaps, I don't watch soaps, they just happen to be on in the background while I'm reading. But if you watch like Emmerdale, for example, there's the pretty blonde lad at the minute who had his son had an affair with a teacher who was not very happy about this, and his head's about to explode. And what do they say to him? They say, well, you need to go and get some help, right? EastEnders, something else was happening. You need to go and get help, right? And within the space of a generation, we all now just presume that if we have emotional difficulties, we need expert support for this. I mean, that's been one of the revolutionary shifts, I think, in the last 30 years. From a presumption that actually perhaps you can look to your family, your friends, or yourself to deal with difficulties, we're actually now looking to the professional classes to support us with the most minute, personal, emotional aspects of our lives. And I think the parenting, the idea of parenting and the support for parenting is tied up with this. And compared to past concerns about parental attachment, we now, the concerns that were raised in the sort of 50s and 60s was that there's a problem of absentee parents. There was an absence of parents. That was the problem. a colleague of mine has very nicely suggested that actually the problem today is the presence of parents. Well, that's how the government understands it, right? Because the parent is not an expert. The parent can't ever really be expected to fully relate to their child in the correct manner. And this is the fantastic thing, I think, is that once you have the idea of parenting experts, and once you have a presumption that parenting experts should be there for everybody, the logic is that, well, parents clearly can't cope because parents aren't experts. They're just parents, right? So, there's once you've got this one, then suddenly there's an issue here. You're not an expert, therefore there's a problem automatically. And the sort of interventionist logic, I think, develops from this. A few problems with experts. I think there's an expansion of expertise, especially around the theme called well-being. Right? So well-being is this thing now. It's a very therapeutic concept. It's everywhere. And it's essentially about your emotional life and the emotional life of a child, which is being expertized, for want of a better real word. So your emotional life starts to become an issue that needs to be looked at. We start to get a discussion about emotional abuse. And emotional abuse, surprise, surprise, suddenly becomes a crime, as it has become in Scotland. And so expertise starts to get broader and broader into more and more areas of parenting life that historically would have been seen as relatively unproblematic. You get experts for things that are not expertable. So parenting, for example, is not expertable, I would argue. Parenting, or being a parent, being part of a family, is about relationships, and it's not really something that you can have an expertise about. An example of this, I was on the radio recently having another annoying discussion, and some expert was on explaining why the naughty step doesn't work. Oh, that's interesting. Super Nanny told everyone 10 years ago the naughty step was be all and end all. Now it seems the naughty step doesn't work. Someone made the funny observation that their child, they have a problem with the naughty step because they send them to the naughty step, and then the child, they say, "Oh, okay, you can come off the naughty step now." No. Not coming off the naughty step. It's beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful. Classic. What a dilemma. Another problem with experts is that they hide belief. Okay, so they'll say evidence shows. Right? It's always the evidence shows, the science suggests. Okay, it's always a matter-of-fact thing. There's evidence and proof. Rather than that, they have beliefs. Right? And they're kind of like they hide their belief. It's never a belief. It's always this neutral thing. It's a kind of independent, sciencey evidence thing. And again, I was trying to think about this in terms of why this is so important. And essentially, I think this is so important because if they had a more honest discussion about this, they believe smacking is wrong, for example, and then argued their case, they lose their expert status because they have a belief, just like you have a belief. Right? We have different beliefs, and their throne that they're sitting on suddenly crumbles because we realize this is a matter of beliefs that we're talking about here. So they desperately need to hold on to talk about science and evidence because that is what makes them what they are. That their authority is based on that, and as soon as that goes, it crumbles. A quick anecdote.
I'll give you a 5-minute warning when you...
All right, okay, good. I've probably got about 8 minutes, if that's all right. Right, okay, right. I'll give you a quick anecdote. I was in the Scottish Parliament. I took my daughter for a laugh. I thought she might enjoy it. She's 18. She came, sat in the back. This was to give oral submission about whether smacking should be made criminal or not. It's actually online. You might find it entertaining because my head exploded at this meeting. I hadn't planned on saying what I said particularly, so it just sort of came out. I vomited it upon the table, if you like. And it was at one stage it was funny because the Liberal Democrat man said to me, "Don't you realise that smacking children begets violence? Violence begets violence." And I turned round to my daughter and said, "I don't know. Why don't we ask my daughter, Lily? I smacked you as a child. Have you begotten violence recently?" My daughter laughs. The rest of the committee don't laugh. And the professor to my left shouts, "That's anecdotal." You see? And there we have it, you see, because she has evidence and science, whereas I just have an anecdote about my lived experience with my daughter, who is not running around stabbing everybody or doing everything else that she's meant to be doing because I dared to smack her. And it's a very democratizing thing, I think, beliefs, forcing people to say it's your belief, because it brings in everybody. It brings in the public, and at the minute the public are outside of this discussion. They are able to dictate to the public because they use this argument of evidence, neuroscience, and science in general, the science, which is often rather bogus in my experience. Another reason I think that they use the discussion about science and hide their beliefs is because their beliefs are obscene and ludicrous. So again, I just use the example of the tap of the hand, right? And I'm defending a light smack of a child in this committee. And the foreign gentleman to my right, who's a human rights lawyer, was morally outraged. He could not believe what I was saying, right? Ooh. It's like the hysterics of the 19th century. I thought he was going to faint. But he did bring in the 19th century, and he said, "I cannot believe what I'm hearing here. This is the same as the 19th century arguments about beating your wife and the arguments of slave owners over slaves." Okay? So that defense is equivalent of slave owners. And I think really what's interesting is that the arguments that a lot of these people use are otherworldly. Right? They are otherworldly, and they are not supported by the vast majority of the public. In fact, the Christian Institute research into this through the Be Reasonable campaign shows this. 75% of people do not think that you should make smacking criminal in Scotland. And yet the opposite is the case with the politicians. 75% of them are going to vote it through, regardless of the public wish. An absolute disgrace. And I think once you start scratching the surface of these caring liberal people, you actually see that their belief or beliefs about people in the family are based on fear and loathing. And I think that is what we need to try and expose. Last little bits. The new elite. I've been interested to try and think about, are they new? There's been intervention in the family for a long time. If you look back to the 19th century, there's a kind of lot of, there was a moral campaigning and a kind of negative view of ordinary people in many respects by certain sections of society, and laws being passed. And I was trying to work out what's the difference. What's the difference that you can sort of, whether you support or don't support these developments. And I think it's kind of quite useful to try and do a comparison, because I think in the 19th century, you had the development of law, but you had the argument about morality. You had moral arguments being put, and not just put, but mass campaigns with ordinary people themselves who had a moral sensibility and a moral belief about how society should run, how you should be as a decent person, a decent parent, a decent family, and so on. These were public moral discussions that were taking place with great leaders and people of all different classes, in fact, involved in this. Again, as I say, whether you agree with their arguments or not. But this is very different from what happens today. You now have the law and experts, rather bloodless experts, who I think are actually very weak. They're not strong leaders with a strong sense of who they are, and they do things behind the back of the public. They talk about science, they talk about evidence, they don't talk about their beliefs. They don't argue with people, they don't have mass campaigns, because they can't, because they would lose. And that's the real difference, I think. And you can see this through the talk of cultural change. Right? This is the argument that they're using about smacking. We need to change the smacking laws so that we have cultural change. Right? Now, cultural change is very different to challenging people's beliefs, because what it means is you have a law that makes something illegal, and then people stop doing it because they're scared of the law. And over time, you have cultural change. You've basically forced us to change our culture through the force of law. It's essentially a form of social engineering, where we and the public are treated like lab rats, contemptuously. And you get a situation where your community, or the nature of your community, is forced upon you. It's not something that develops out of you, out of your neighbours, and out of a common sensibility. It's a rather alienated, forced process, this new culture, which I think will always mean that even our most intimate lives feel never quite our own, because it's not something that has actually grown up amongst us. And finally, a note of optimism. He says, as a total pessimist, but times are changing. They are very confused at times and very unclear, but I think there is definitely a reaction to the era of the expert taking place at the minute. I think there is a demand for autonomy in politics, again in all sorts of weird and wonderful and not so wonderful ways, but nevertheless something is happening. And I think there is potentially the space to promote the positive, progressive idea of the autonomy of the family as well, and expose the dehumanizing, interventionist zeal of the modern experts. Thank you.